So you had to assume that there was some collusion, some planning, some reasonably bright psychological analysis that had taken place on how to turn off people from the regime and the Shah, and that this all sort of coincided. The Mujahideen were probably the most adept at this part of it. I can't believe it was the religious. I don't think they would have done that sort of thing. The religious were doing other things. The religious were passing tapes around of the Ayatollah speeches and so on. And the underground was working very nicely in that regard. No, it was a congeries of opposition to the Shah that coincided, as I've said before, on only one thing, getting rid of the Shah, but did not agree on what the form, substance, or objectives of the government would be after the Shah left. And you could see that. The Ayatollah, who was probably one of the most surprised people of all when he found himself sort of in power, had nobody prepared to run a government. And that's why he named Bazargan, who was one of the few respectable Iranian politicians who had supported him and opposed his exile, and opposed Bazargan was about the only politician with enough standing to head a government. But of course he headed a meaningless government. They wouldn't let it govern. And the creation of the Revolutionary Guards, which was a Mujahideen, I believe, operation at the outset, was gradually taken over by the religious. And maybe with the connivance of communists, I don't know. The Iranians today aren't sure and are still positive that the mullahs, the Soviet mullahs, are the ones who are running the show and eventually are going to turn it into a Soviet.
What do you think of that?
I think it's highly unlikely.
The Tudehs are not evident on the outside.
Well, the Tudeh party was never highly respectable anyway.
Yeah.
But the Soviet mullahs, another question, because the Soviet government did subsidize mullahs to a fairly well for many years, and probably still is. So it's and there is no, apparently in their mind, there's nothing wrong with them taking help from the Soviets.
Now, to what degree do you subscribe to the theory that U.S.-Iran relations in the late 70s represented what's called an intelligence failure, in the sense that the revolution and the Shah's downfall came as such a surprise to American policymakers and American businessmen and so forth who had to do with Iran?
I can only quote, I think, some of my academic friends. When I came back in the end of 78, I gave a lecture up at the Asia Society in New York. And I had a couple of academics there as well who were talking at the same time. And they publicly admitted that they blew it, that they were looking at the wrong things, that the things we should have been noticing, we were so bedazzled by the magnificence of the Shah and his imperial trappings, and we simply couldn't see what was happening in the underbrush of Iranian politics and political sentiment. And if the professed experts of the subject don't see it, and I believe if you'll read Tony, what was the name of the last British ambassador there? Tony Parsons' book. He expresses some of the sentiment, that they missed it too. And Dennis Wright certainly missed it. And he was one of the old pros of the business. So that if the experts in the subject missed it, how the heck do you expect the poor businessman to see it? We were riding along on a wave of euphoria that hoped to take advantage of the oil income, most of us. And maybe it was falsely engendered hope, but nonetheless there was that hope. And just for simple businessmen, not political analysts. So, although we pride ourselves, usually, businessmen do, on being able to feel things better than embassies sometimes. The embassy was no better off. I mean, we were all surprised. We were all caught unawares. And certainly, the one factor that might have made a difference to certain policymakers in the United States was the knowledge of the Shah's illness. Had that one fact been known, a lot of things would have come clearer. Maybe, I don't know. But the efforts to make sense out of the regime from 1973 to 78, to control corruption, to control conspicuous consumption, which was ridiculous, the things that went on by some of the wealthy Iranians, were simply ineffective and to use a terrible word, counterproductive in terms of keeping popular support for the regime.
This is a question I should have asked you at the very beginning of our interview. But when you were first assigned to the embassy in Tehran, did you receive any special area training?
No.
In Persian history or society or
no,
anything like that?
No, because I went. If I don't miss my guess, I was under a good deal of pressure to get there in a hurry. And I had come from Naples, where I'd been deputy principal officer for the previous 3 years, and I went to home leave, had a little bit of consultation in the department, maybe a week, 10 days, and then I arrived and was thrown into the breach. Now, of course, I had had some Persian language before. I'd served in Afghanistan many years before, and I had some knowledge of the area. I had served in South Asian affairs, Pakistan, Afghanistan affairs, and so I wasn't totally abjectly stupid. Although I wasn't as well prepared as I would like to have been. But both Armin Meyer, who was the ambassador at the time, I was selected at least, and Nick Thatcher, who was the deputy chief of mission, knew me well, and so they were quite prepared to take me on faith.
How many of the embassy staff people at this time actually had area training before they took the job? Was your experience fairly common among?
Well, no. When the people who were in the embassy at the time were some of them were long-time Middle East hands. Nick Thatcher was the DCM. Jack Armitage, this was his second time round he was a political counselor. John Rouse, who was in the political section, was a Persian language officer. Ed Prince, who was my deputy in the economic section, had been there for 4 or 5 years and spoke Persian and was quite good. The head of the chief of station was an old hand there, Bill Brommel. My oil man, petroleum officer, I can't think of his name.
Washburn?
No, his predecessor. Again, was a very able guy, both in petroleum and spoke Arabic, I believe, as well. Arabic besides Persian. And then John Washburn came along, and he was a Persian language officer. And he was followed by David Patterson, who was another Persian language officer. So that I thought at the time I was there in the embassy that, there were a number of other good Persian language officers. Michaud was one. John Stemple. The whole.
He was there then also?
Yeah, Arnie Rapel was a Persian language officer. There were a whole series of young officers who were very good in Persian. And so I thought we were well served. Stan Escudero. There's a whole raft of kids. But by the time 78 came along, there was practically nobody.
Do you know what accounted for that? Or?
Yeah, budgetary strictures more than anything else. Yeah. The Carterian budgetary revolution, the Ford revolution, so forth and so
on. Now from your testimony, it sounds like you had fairly frequent contact with Iranian government officials, and this has been when you were at the embassy.
Yeah.
How true is that of other officials in the embassy? It's probably hard to generalize about that.
It's hard to generalize. The political section had a lot to do with the Foreign Office. And certainly the political military officer, whether he was John Rouse or Henry Proctor or Martin, had a good deal to do with both the American military and some of the Iranians and General Tufanian's staff. Not beyond that, I don't believe. The military attaches' offices had their counterparts, probably the people who were approved by the Shah for dealing with them. But I don't get the impression that many of them had the breadth of associations across the government that I had. And I say that without any pride particularly, but that's just the way it was. I was there longer than most of them to begin with. I was there 5 years in the embassy after all.
Now, to what extent did your own context extend beyond the business community and government officials when you were at the embassy?
On the Iranian side?
Yeah.
Well, there were considerable social intercourse outside the business side. My wife, of course, was busy in the International Women's Club, the Nurayn Society, which is the blind school down in Isfahan, and it was a very social organization in the sense that it was supported by some very high-level, socially impeccable ladies, led by Sedige. I heard she was a Farman princess, one of the direct descendants of one of the Qajar Shah's granddaughter. Had lunch with her and her husband a couple of months ago or something at Rustegar.
That was her name?
Rastegar, Rustegar. But that sort of we had that sort of connection with a lot of Iranians who were not government, not official, not business. In the Samian family, Mrs. Samian was one of the earliest leaders of women's rights in Iran. The family was a close friend of ours. Of course, they were variously married into a number of other families. Abbas Fala, Reza Fala's brother, was married to one of the Samian sisters, and so on down the line.
I read that somewhere around half of the embassy employees were from local minority groups. I think it's
Yes, it was known as the Armenian Embassy.
Yeah, a very large component of Armenian Christians.
Yes, and some Zoroastrians and some Jews and some Baha'is. But we had a pretty good mixture of Pukka Persians too. My chief local in the economic commercial section was Ismail Gobadi, more socially acceptable he couldn't be. He's a very highly respected man.
Now, in his new book, James Bill suggests the existence of a fairly large component of Iranian minorities. The embassy staff had adverse implications. One was that the Armenians, a lot of them worked in the consular section apparently. Apparently from his research suggested they were often rude to local Iranians who were applying for passports. And this had an impact on the way they perceived the United States. This is their first contact with American officials. And
my friend,
yeah. Anyway,
I don't care whether it's Iran or London or Paris or Karachi or wherever it is, locals are rude to their own people. And yes, they can say that the Armenians may have been rude to the Iranians. I would posit that would have made no difference whatever.
So it's a generic embassy problem.
Yeah, generic embassy problem, right. You take on a little bit of power when you're with the American embassy, whether you're Armenian or Zoroastrian or Muslim or whatever. And besides, I have to believe that at least some of those people in the consulate were Savak employees on the side as well.
So was that?
Oh, sure, common practice.
Yeah.
They were sprinkled throughout the locals. You could identify some of them very easily.
And Bill also suggests that the existence of a fairly large minority component among the employees tended to insulate the embassy from day-to-day contact with Muslim Armenians. Was this seen as an issue at that time?
Not, at least in the economic commercial section, not so. There was no one more Muslim than the Lajavardis and the Khosrowshahis and the Irvanis and the Barkhordars and so on. And yet we had very open, close relations with them, and didn't depend on the locals for that sort of entree at all. The average Bazari is a little more difficult, but as many of the Bazari, for instance, drug dealers, were Jews or Iranians or Armenians anyway, and so that was the extent of a lot of the embassy employees' association with local business. They were a rug and curio dealer, and they were Armenians or Jews anyway.
Now he also talks sort of interesting about the embassy social secretary, who was
Iranian. Yes.
Apparently, she more or less determined who would be invited to embassy functions.
Well, for some embassies she did, for some ambassadors she did, but not for Dick Helms and not for Bill Sullivan, and that turned her into a real Herod.
Yeah, apparently he says that some ambassador tried to weaken her authority or influence something.
They not only weakened her, they just ignored her. Mrs. Helms couldn't stand her.
What's her name?
Minu Moshiri.
But apparently when she had some authority in this issue, she tended to confine those she invited to the social, economic elite.
Exactly.
Keeping out other Iranians,
sure.
more middle class types.
Yeah. Well, no question about it, but the invitation lists oftentimes, depending on what the invitations were for instance, the economic commercial section would submit its list of people, and most often we would get them invited if it was a big reception. And 4th of July was another bash. It was a real enormous collection of people. It didn't really matter. It's easy to criticize embassy ambassadors' entertainment lists, it's harder still to construct one that escapes criticism.
Okay. Now this is another point that he raised in his book that's also been raised by other writers on the period. He argues that because of the strong pro-Shah views at the highest levels in Washington and the embassy, that independent objective reports that might cast a bad light on the regime were either not written because they could hurt career advancement in some respects, or when they were written, they were sometimes suppressed or not sent to Washington. Was this, to what extent was that a problem when you were at the embassy in the early 70s? Were there examples of that come to mind, or?
I killed one report because it was not because of any bias that might reflect adversely on anybody. And certainly the officer in question has not suffered because I killed it, and I didn't suffer because I killed it. It was just a stupid report. But it was the only one that I can think of that I killed in the 5 years that I was there that would faintly fall into that category. Indeed, the reports that we sent in on such things as corruption, and I believe you will find somewhere in the archive.
We talked about that. In fact, he cites that as one that did get to Washington.
Yeah,
was
John Washburn,
right,
for one. We got criticized for dwelling on corruption, but there was a real problem. And but again, there was never any stricture, any order out, and no instructions not to send anything in. Now, self-censorship, that may have taken place.
That's what he was implying, that might have been a sort of internal constraint. People might have feared rocking the boat somewhere.
Well, it's kind of hard to demonstrate, and it's hard to, when you are dealing with a one-party government and a one-dimensional government that is run by one man, and everybody depends on his whims and his judgments and his sources of information. It's hard to write sensible analyses of what's going on in the countryside when, nobody's talking. The opposition didn't want to talk to us to begin with. They didn't want to be seen with us. They knew we were followed, and so they had reasons for not talking to us. There was no way we could hide, disguise ourselves. We were so damn visible, and especially when we got tagged with bodyguards everywhere we went. What the heck were you supposed to do?
Well, I think I've also read, I think this wasn't mentioned in Phil's book, that by the mid-70s, maybe this is after you left, that the number of political officers had declined, and there was less reporting going on in internal political affairs than there had been, say, in the 60s to late 60s period. That might have been a budgetary problem, the decline of political officers, or I don't know, but was that
no, I don't think that's. I don't buy that particularly. There was never a big number of political officers anyway. There was a political counselor and the assistant political officer, and the political military officer, and usually one other officer. And that was about it, 4 or 5 all told. And I don't know that it ever varied from that another time I knew them.
I guess it might have been more than 10 or 15 in the early 60s. That's the figure he gives, I think. That something of that order. But there was a lot more.
Dubious, highly dubious. Now, if he's going on the Foreign Service list record, some of those may have been stationed CIA people.
Yeah.
Who had other...
listed as political officers,
yeah,
but other actually doing something else.
Yeah. Real State Department political reporting officers were never more than 3 or 4. to my certain knowledge, in the 10 years that I was associated with it.
Well, I have no further questions unless you want to make a concluding.
No, I don't have any peroration.
We covered all the issues. I think, fairly well.
I don't know that we've come to any final conclusion on what happened, but it's been, it was in retrospect a traumatic experience, and one that almost defies analysis to some degree, because if you talk to some of my Iranian friends, they are certain that the whole success of the Ayatollah was the result of British planning assisted by American dupes for the sole purpose of keeping oil prices up so North Sea oil was profitable. Now, there's a certain mad logic to all of that. But somehow all the rest of the facts don't fit it. And yet the conspiratorial view of the world is so widespread in Iran that there are thousands and thousands of Iranians who are prepared to believe that or a variation of that theme. And it is extremely difficult for any of us to argue convincingly that such was not the case, because all we can argue is the bits we saw don't fit that theory, and the people we know certainly were not smart enough to plan it. And if the Brits and CIA were smart enough to plan all of this, why are we in such bad shape around the world? I think that's enough to say.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you.